The morning Jennie Abbott stood in the middle of her father's ruined cattle pen, mud to her ankles and rain still dripping off the brim of her hat, she made a decision that would change the entire course of her life. She was going to save this ranch or die trying, and she was going to do it alone. The year was 1882, and the town of Caldwell, Kansas sat on the edge of the Kishom Trail like a sentry post between civilization and everything wild that lay beyond it. Cattle drives still rumbled through, though fewer than before. The railroad had pushed progress through the territory like a hot iron, and men who had once been cowboys found themselves competing with wire fences and steam-powered machinery. But out on the Abbott spread, 15 miles south of town, none of that modern creep had arrived yet. It was still raw land, stubborn land, and it had been in Jennie's family for 12 years. Her father, Samuel Abbott, had died 6 weeks before on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, slumped over the fence post he had been repairing, his heart simply giving out without warning. He was 53 years old, leathered and lean and strong as a post himself, or so everyone had thought. The doctor said it was the kind of thing that happened without permission and without reason, and Jennie had buried him beside her mother under the twin cottonwood trees at the east end of the property and stood there in the cold without crying, because crying felt like giving up, and giving up was something the Abbotts had never done. She was 26 years old. She had never married, not because no one had asked, but because no one who asked had ever seemed worth the asking. She had thick dark hair she kept pinned under a wide-brimmed hat, eyes the color of creek water after a storm, and hands that were no stranger to hard work. She had spent her entire life learning this ranch from her father, and she knew every acre of it, every temperamental waterway, every spot where the grass went thin, and every place where the cattle liked to gather at dusk. She knew the land the way you know a person you have lived beside for a very long time. What she did not know was how to do all of it at once. Her father had kept 2 ranch hands through the years, older men named Pete and Clarence, who had been loyal to Samuel Abbott the way loyal men sometimes are when they are given steady work and fair wages. But Pete had gotten word of a brother dying in Missouri and had left 2 weeks after Samuel's funeral, and Clarence, who was pushing 60 and whose knees had been giving him grief for 3 years running, had finally told Jennie with considerable sorrow that he couldn't keep up the pace any longer. He'd offered to stay through November, and she had thanked him for it, and on the first day of December she found herself entirely alone. The ranch was not small. It ran to 400 acres, with a herd of 83 cattle, a dozen horses, a chicken yard, 2 working dogs, and a barn that needed its east wall shored up before the hard freeze came. There was a water line that fed the troughs from a spring-fed creek to the north that required daily monitoring, fencing that needed constant attention along the south ridge, and feed stores that needed to be tracked and rotated with the kind of care that added up across the seasons like interest on a debt. The men in town had opinions about it. The men in town always had opinions. She had gone to pick up feed supplies at Hayloren's grain store the second week of December, and she had overheard 2 men talking near the back counter while they thought she was out of earshot. One of them was Darrell Prewitt, who owned the neighboring spread to the west, a heavy-set man in his 40s who had approached Jennie twice about buying the Abbott land and who wore his certainty about the world like a second coat. "She won't last the winter," he said, and his voice carried the comfortable ease of a man who believed he was stating fact. "A woman alone on 400 acres. She'll sell by spring, or she'll have to hire every man between here and Wichita to keep it going." The other man, someone Jennie didn't recognize, made a low sound of agreement. Jennie had set her jaw, paid for her supplies, and loaded the wagon herself. But Darrell Prewitt had not been entirely wrong, and that was the part that gnawed at her on the long drive home. She was good. She was strong and smart and capable, and she had been watching and learning her whole life. But there were real limits to what one body could do before sunrise and after sundown, and she had already started to feel them pulling at her like a current. It was Halloran himself, behind the counter, who had leaned forward and said in a low voice before she left, "You know there's a man been asking around for day work. Comes well recommended out of Texas. Name's Warren Shepard." Jennie had nodded once and said she would keep it in mind, and then she had driven home and told herself she didn't need anyone. Warren Shepard had come to Caldwell the way a lot of men came through that town in those years, on the tail end of something that had ended and looking, without admitting it, for something new. He was 31 years old, tall in the way that made people give him space without knowing why, with sun-weathered skin and dark eyes that took their time arriving at conclusions. He had spent 8 years working cattle on the King Ranch down in Texas, had ridden 3 full drives up the Kisham Trail, and had once helped break a horse that 3 other men before him had given up on. He was quiet in the way that comes not from shyness but from a long habit of paying attention. He had come north partly because the big Texas outfits were consolidating, buying out the smaller operations and reducing the hands they needed, and partly because he had a restlessness in him that even he couldn't fully explain. He had heard about the Kansas spreads, about the land that was still independent and scrappy and full of possibility, and something about that had pulled at him. He had been in Caldwell for 10 days, staying at the boarding house on 2nd Street, doing odd jobs for the livery stable and quietly asking around for more substantial work. He was not a man who worried much, but he was a man who paid attention, and what he kept hearing in the saloons and at the grain store and at the livery was talk about the Abbott Ranch and the woman running it alone. He had not gone out there looking for a situation to rescue. That was not how Warren Shepard's mind worked. He had gone because Halloran had told him there was honest work available and a fair wage attached to it, and because he was the kind of man who liked working land that still meant something to somebody. He rode out on a Thursday morning in mid-December, the sky a flat gray sheet pressing down on the brown plains, his breath misting ahead of him on the cold air. He found the ranch without trouble. The gate was well made, solid posts and clean wire, a good sign, and he rode in along the track toward the house and barn. He saw her before she saw him. She was working on the east wall of the barn, not supervising, not directing, but actually working, her boots planted in the frozen mud. A plank of timber braced against her shoulder as she positioned it against the sagging wall frame. She had her coat pushed up at the sleeves, and she was swearing quietly and steadily at the timber like it was a disagreement she intended to win. Warren Shepard pulled his horse up and sat there for a moment watching, not because he was being impolite but because the sight of it stopped something in him. She was clearly competent. She was clearly furious. And there was something about the combination that was, in a way he didn't have the vocabulary for yet, entirely compelling. He dismounted, tied his horse to the rail, and called out, "You want a second pair of hands on that." Jennie Abbott turned around with the timber still braced against her shoulder and looked at him with the exact expression of a woman who has been interrupted mid-argument with inanimate objects. Her eyes swept him once, quick and thorough, the way you assess a horse or a storm cloud. "Depends," she said, "on whether you know what you're doing or whether you're going to stand there telling me what I'm doing wrong." "I wasn't planning to tell you anything," he said. "I was planning to hold the other end." She looked at him for another moment, then jerked her chin toward the far side of the plank. He crossed the yard, picked up his end without ceremony, and they wrestled the timber into place together. It went in clean, better than it would have gone with just one person fighting it, and Jennie reached for the nails she had lined up along the fence rail and drove them with a hammer in 4 fast, sure strokes. "Warren Shepard," he said when it was done. "I know who you are," she said. "Halloran told me you might come out. You didn't send for me." "No," she said evenly. "I didn't." He nodded. "That was fair enough." "I'm not looking for charity work," he said. "I'm looking for a ranch that needs a hand and can offer fair wages through the winter and into the spring. If that's not what you have, I'll turn around now and we'll both have lost nothing but a morning." Jennie pulled off her work gloves and tucked them under her arm. The cold was coming in harder now, and she could feel it in her fingers and in the back of her jaw. She looked at the barn wall they had just set, and then she looked at the length of the south fence line she still needed to walk before dark, and then she looked at the man standing in front of her. "I can offer you fair wages," she said. "I can offer you meals and the use of the bunkhouse. I can offer you steady, hard work from before sunup until after sundown every day, weather be damned." She paused. "What I cannot offer you is an easy situation or a boss who takes kindly to being told what she doesn't know." Warren Shepard almost smiled. It was close enough to a smile that she noticed it. "I'm not much of one for easy situations," he said. She put her hand out and he shook it, and that was how the arrangement began. What happened over the next 2 weeks was a kind of careful, deliberate getting to know. The kind that happens when two capable people are working too hard and too closely together to bother with pretense. They did not have conversations about themselves or their lives, not at first. What they had were tasks, and the conversations that grew up around tasks are an honest kind of conversation. You learn a great deal about a person watching them work. Warren learned that Jennie Abbott had precise opinions about almost everything and could defend all of them with specific reasons. He learned that she could fix a water line and rope a stray heifer and red weather better than anyone he had ever worked with. He learned that she took her coffee without sugar, that she was kind to her dogs in a matter-of-fact way that suggested she did not think kindness required performance, and that she had a laugh she seemed to keep in reserve for moments she had not planned on. Jennie learned that Warren Shepard did not offer his opinion unless asked, which she appreciated deeply, and that when he did offer it, it was worth hearing. She learned that he was methodical in a way that complemented rather than duplicated her own approach, that he had a patience with difficult animals that came from genuine respect for what they were, and that he could work an entire day without needing to fill the silence with noise. She also learned, in those first 2 weeks, that Darrell Pruitt had not given up on acquiring the Abbott land. He came to the ranch on a Wednesday morning, riding a horse that was too fine for the kind of man he was, and he sat on it at the gate and called out for Jennie as if he owned the air above the place. She came out of the barn with a look on her face that Warren, watching from the paddock fence, catalogued privately as the look of someone who had expected this and had already decided how to handle it. "Jennie," Pruitt said without dismounting, "I want to have a straight conversation with you." "Then have one," she said, and she planted her feet the way she planted them when she was bracing timber. "This land would run better as part of my operation," Pruitt said. "I'll give you a fair price, more than fair. You take it, you walk away comfortable. You don't have to spend the next 10 years of your life killing yourself out here." "I'm not killing myself," Jennie said. "I'm running a ranch. One woman alone can't run a ranch this size. Anyone who tells you different is lying to your face." There was a pause. Warren did not move from his position at the paddock fence, but he felt something tighten in him, the way it does when someone says something they have no business saying. "I have a ranch hand," Jennie said, her voice flat and steady. "And I am running this operation the same as my father ran it, and I have no intention of selling. Not to you, not to anyone." Pruitt's eyes cut to Warren for a moment, assessing, and then came back to Jennie. "When it falls apart," he said, with the particular cruelty of a man who likes to think he is being honest, "you know where to find me." He turned his horse and rode off, and Jennie watched him go until he was through the gate, and then she turned back to the barn. Warren waited. After a moment she said, without looking at him, "Don't say anything." "Wasn't planning to," he said. She disappeared into the barn, and he heard the sound of her picking up where she had left off with the feed stores, methodical and steady, and something in him found that steadiness remarkable. Christmas came and went quietly. Jennie had no family left to visit, and Warren had none nearby. She cooked a proper meal, roast beef and biscuits, and a dried apple pie that filled the small kitchen with a warmth that had nothing to do with the oven, and she set a place at the kitchen table for both of them, and they ate together in the way that two people eat who have gotten used to each other's company without quite having the words for it yet. "Where are you from originally?" she asked him, and it was the first personal question she had asked. "Odessa, Texas," he said. My folks had a small spread. We lost it when I was 16. I went to work after that. You miss Texas. He thought about it in the honest way he thought about things. I miss the particular smell of it in the morning, he said. The land up here is good land, but it smells different. She smiled at that, and it was one of the unplanned ones, the kind she kept in reserve. What does Kansas smell like to you? Like something that hasn't been decided yet, he said. She looked at him for a moment across the table, and there was something in that look that neither of them had an immediate accounting for. Then she reached for another biscuit and asked him whether he thought the spring calving would come early based on the way the herd had been moving, and the moment shifted into the comfortable, practical current that was their default mode of being with each other. January was brutal. The cold came in from the north like something with a purpose, and the ranch demanded everything they had. There was a stretch of 4 days in mid-January when the temperature dropped so low that the water troughs froze solid despite the heaters, and they were out before 5 in the morning every day breaking ice and carrying extra water by hand in buckets across the frozen yard. The cattle were restless and the horses were fractious, and one of the 2 working dogs, the older one named Biscuit, went lame with something wrong in his left rear leg that Jennie diagnosed with quiet, careful hands and treated with poultices and rest. During those 4 brutal days, they moved with a kind of wordless efficiency that you see sometimes between people who have found the rhythm of each other without ceremony. Warren hauled. Jennie directed and worked beside him. They spelled each other without being asked and anticipated needs without announcing them. And at the end of the 4th day, when the temperature finally lifted, and they came in from the last round of the evening, both of them cold to the bone and too tired for speech, Jennie poured 2 cups of coffee and set one on the table in front of him without a word, and Warren sat down and wrapped his hands around it and felt, for the first time in a long time, like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He did not say that, but he felt it. It was the 3rd week of January when things shifted in a way that neither of them had planned. They had been working the south fence all morning, a section that had been undermined by frost heave and needed to be reset from the post bottoms up. It was tedious, cold, exhausting work, and they had been at it since before light. By midday they had made good progress, and they stopped to eat the biscuits and cold salt pork that Jennie had packed, sitting on the fence they had already repaired, the winter sun hitting the frost on the grass and making everything briefly silver. "Can I ask you something?" Warren said. "You can try," she said. "Why does it matter so much?" He paused, looking out across the silver field. "The ranch, I understand it's your home. I understand it was your father's. But you're fighting for this in a way that goes past any of that." Jennie was quiet for a moment. She looked down at the biscuit in her hand, and then out across the land the same way he was looking. "My mother came out here from Virginia when she was 22 years old," she said. "She didn't want to come. Her family thought my father was marrying beneath his prospects by settling on frontier land, and they were not kind about saying so. But she came anyway because she trusted him and because she believed in what they were building." She paused. "She died the winter I was 15. Influenza. And my father and I ran this place together for 11 years after that, and the whole time I was learning it, every acre, every waterway, every seasonal pattern, I was learning something she helped build." Warren didn't say anything. He listened. "When my father died," she continued, "the first person who came to the door, the very first person, was Darrell Pruitt with a number written on a piece of paper. He didn't even wait until after the burial." Her voice was steady, but there was something moving under the steadiness like water under ice. "And I knew that every man in town expected me to sell or fail, because they have never believed that a woman can run land like this. And I knew that the only answer worth giving to all of that was to run this ranch better than it's ever been run. Not to spite them, not to prove something to them, to prove something to myself." The silver light was very still around them. "I think," Warren said, carefully and honestly, "that you've already proven it." She turned to look at him, and something passed between them that was different from anything that had passed before, warmer and more complicated and more honest. "I haven't proven it yet," she said. "I'll have proven it when I come through the spring calving and into the summer with this herd intact and this land in good order. That's when it's proven." "All right," he said. And then, because he was a man who said what he meant, "I believe you can do it." She held his gaze for a long moment. "I know you do," she said. "That's the only reason having you here doesn't feel like losing the argument." He smiled at that fully, the first real broad smile she had seen from him, and it did something to the arrangement of her thoughts that she filed away to examine later when she was alone and there was time for it. They went back to the fence, and they worked the rest of the afternoon in their usual companionable quiet, but the quality of the quiet had changed, had become something with more warmth in it, and they both noticed without acknowledging it. February brought a thaw, the false kind that tricks the earth into believing spring is coming before the last cold reaches back in and reminds it of its mistake. Jennie used the thaw productively, pushing through the list of repairs and preparations she had been building in her head all winter. They fixed the roof of the main house where a shingle had been lifting since November. They serviced the windmill above the north pasture. They assessed the cattle herd for spring calving timing and found 6 heifers that were carrying their first calves and would need closer watching. It was during the thaw that Warren learned about Jennie's father's ledger book. He had come into the kitchen one evening for a lamp he had left there and found her at the kitchen table with the book open and an expression on her face that was concentrated and troubled. She looked up when he came in, and he could see the numbers over the top of the book and the way her finger was tracking down the columns. "How bad is it?" he asked, because he had enough experience with ranch finances to read the situation on her face. She considered whether to answer honestly. Then she said, "We're carrying some debt from last year. My father had to replace the windmill and repair the water line in the same season, and the cattle prices were down." "Catastrophic, but the margin is tight." She looked at the ledger. "I need to have a strong spring, good calving numbers, and a fair price at the drives. What's the timeline on the debt?" "The bank note is due in June." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, and she didn't tell him not to, which meant she was willing to have the conversation. "Show me," he said. She turned the book toward him, and they sat together at the kitchen table for the better part of 2 hours going through the numbers. Warren had been foreman long enough on the King Ranch to understand balance sheets, and he had a careful, systematic mind for it. Jennie had been managing the finances herself since October, and she had a solid grasp, but 2 heads working the same problem from different angles will always find things one head alone might miss. They found 3 places where the operating costs could be trimmed slightly without affecting the quality of the operation. They calculated the likely revenue from the spring calving if the numbers ran close to historical averages. And they found, when they worked it through completely, that the margin was tight but achievable, provided nothing went seriously wrong. "Nothing goes seriously wrong," Warren said, with the mildly dry observation of a man who had spent enough time in ranching to know how that sentence always ended. "Nothing goes seriously wrong," Jennie agreed, with almost exactly the same tone, and they both looked at the ledger for a moment, and then Jennie laughed, the unplanned kind, and Warren followed her, and it was the first time either of them had truly laughed in that kitchen, and the sound of it seemed to fill the room in a way that was almost physical. They sat with the last of the coffee after the ledger was closed, and for the first time it wasn't the comfortable silence of 2 people with tasks between them. It was the comfortable silence of 2 people who were simply at ease with each other. "You're good with numbers," she said. "I had a foreman position for 2 years," he said. "You learn them or you drown in them." "Why did you leave foreman work?" He looked at his coffee cup. "The ranch I was foreman on got absorbed into a bigger outfit. The new owners brought their own people in. It wasn't personal, it was just the way the business went. But I'd put a lot of myself into building what was there." He paused. It was a hard thing to walk away from. She understood that. She understood it completely, and he could see from her face that she did. "Is that why this matters to you?" she asked, and she was asking about the ranch, about why he worked the way he did, with the genuine investment of a man who was not simply drawing a wage. He looked at her for a moment. "Partly," he said. "Partly it's this specific place. And partly it's—" He stopped himself, because what he was about to say was more than he had planned on saying. "Partly it's what?" she said. He looked at her directly, the way he always looked at things, taking his time and being honest. "Partly it's the person who built it and who's fighting for it," he said. The kitchen was very quiet. The lamp between them made the shadows move slightly on the wall. Jennie did not look away from him. "Warren," she said. "I know," he said. "We don't have to—" "I'm not afraid of it," she said, interrupting him, and her voice was steady in that way. She had that particular steadiness that held its ground without hardness. "I'm just not sure what to do with it." "Neither am I," he said. "I haven't been." They sat with that honesty for a moment, both of them looking at the place where the admission had landed between them on the table. "Let's not rush anything," she said finally. "Let me get through the spring first. Let me prove what I need to prove." "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "Good," she said, and something in her voice had softened in a way that she allowed and did not try to take back. February deepened back into cold as she had known it would. The false thaw closed up and the frost returned, and Jennie went back to the grinding routine of winter ranching, but something had shifted. The warmth that had entered the dynamic between them didn't leave with the thaw. It was there now in the mornings, when he poured her coffee without asking, and set it on the kitchen counter exactly where she would reach for it. It was there in the evenings when she mentioned something that needed doing and he was already halfway to doing it. It was there in the way they stood sometimes side by side watching the herd from the paddock fence, and the distance between them was less than it needed to be by any practical measure. They had not kissed. They had not spoken directly about what was growing between them since that night at the kitchen table. But it was there, steady and accumulating, the way snow accumulates, quietly and with weight. In early March, the town of Caldwell had its opinion about it. Jennie had gone to pick up supplies and stopped in at the post office, and she overheard two women talking in the way women sometimes do when they have been marinating a topic until it's tender. One of them was Martha Pruitt, Darrell's wife, which explained the flavor of what she was saying. A single woman keeping a man in her bunkhouse, Martha was saying to her companion, with the particular satisfaction of someone who believes that moral commentary is a service they provide. Her father would be ashamed. Jennie stopped in the doorway. She thought of her father, who had been the fairest man she had ever known. She thought of her mother, who had stood on frontier land when people told her she was foolish, and had built something beautiful anyway. And then she walked fully into the post office and collected her mail and said good morning to the postmaster with a level, pleasant voice. And she did not acknowledge Martha Pruitt's sharp intake of breath by so much as a glance. On the way home, driving the wagon with the winter light cutting across the flat Kansas plain, she thought about what it meant to be a woman in this territory in this year, in 1882, in this world that had already decided what she was capable of and what she was allowed to do. The injustice of it was not new. She had grown up next to it, and her mother before her had grown up next to it, and the women on the frontier carried their capabilities with them like parcels in their arms that the world frequently pretended not to see. She was not bitter about it. Bitterness was expensive, and she had always been careful about what she spent, but she was clear-eyed. When she got home, Warren was in the paddock working with one of the younger horses, a gray quarter-horse gelding that had been reluctant about ground work since they'd acquired him in the fall. She watched from the wagon as he stood in the middle of the paddock with a long rope, moving quietly around the animal in slow, deliberate circles, his whole body language patient and clear. The horse was watching him with one ear back and one forward, which was the right kind of tension, the kind that was paying attention rather than preparing to bolt. She unhitched the wagon horse herself, settled him in his stall, and then came and leaned on the paddock rail. "Town have anything interesting to say today?" Warren asked, without looking at her, keeping his attention on the gray. "Martha Pruitt thinks you're a scandal," she said. He glanced over at her then, just briefly. "Do you think? I think Darryl Pruitt has been sending his wife to do his discouraging for him because I've already refused to be discouraged by him directly." "That sounds about right," Warren said, and turned his attention back to the gray. "I also think," she said, and her voice was careful and honest, "that people are going to talk regardless of what I do or don't do, and I've decided to stop managing their opinions and start managing this ranch." "That's always been the right decision," he said. The gray horse took 2 steps toward him, tentative but clear, and Warren stayed perfectly still and let him come. "He's going to be a good horse," Jennie said. "He already is," Warren said. "He just doesn't know it yet." She looked at the side of his face in the cold afternoon light, and she felt something move through her chest that was warm and unhurried and certain. She did not say anything about it, but she filed it carefully away where it sat and grew. March moved into its middle weeks, and then it happened. One of the heifers calved early, in the small cold hours of a Tuesday morning, and Jennie was there for it because she had been monitoring the pen hourly since the heifer started showing signs. She came to get Warren from the bunkhouse without apology or hesitation, and he came immediately, fully alert in the way of a man who has pulled his share of difficult calves, and together they worked through a long, hard night. It was a breech birth, the calf coming wrong, and for an hour it looked like they might lose both. Warren's voice was calm throughout, talking to Jennie in the low, steady way he had, telling her what he was thinking, asking what she was thinking, their decisions made together with the compressed efficiency of people under real pressure. Jennie worked with her sleeves rolled up and her jaw set, and there was a moment near the worst of it when their eyes met across the heifer's laboring body, and something passed between them that was too immediate and too real for either of them to set aside later. The calf came eventually, big and wet and indignant, and the heifer recovered, and Jennie stood up with her arms aching and her back aching and looked at the calf standing on its unsteady legs in the hay, and she put her hands over her face for a moment. "Hey," Warren said. He was beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him through the cold of the barn. "He's all right." "I know," she said from behind her hands. "I know he is." He waited. She took her hands down. Her eyes were bright. She was not a woman who cried easily or often, but the aftermath of an hour of that kind of sustained focus and fear will crack even the steadiest person a little at the seams. "I'm fine," she said. "I know you are," he said, and he said it in a way that made it completely clear he was not saying it dismissively. He was saying it because he meant it, because he knew exactly how strong she was and had known it since the first day. They stood in the barn with the new calf making small sounds beside his mother, and the darkness outside the barn full of the deep quiet of 3 in the morning. And Jennie turned toward him and Warren put his arms around her, simply and without announcement, and she let herself lean into it for exactly the amount of time that she needed to. And then she straightened up, and he let her go, and they were both different for it in a way that neither pretended they were not. They walked back to the house together in the cold dark, and she made coffee because neither of them was going to sleep any more that night, and they sat at the kitchen table as they had before, but now the warmth between them was not something either of them was working at managing. It was just present and natural and acknowledged, the way things are when they have found their level. "I have something I want to say," she said. "Say it," he said. "I am going to prove this ranch can run," she said. "I am going to get through the spring calving and get through the summer and pay off that bank note and be standing on this land in good shape by the time autumn comes. That is what I am going to do." "I know it," he said. "And I want to do it," she said carefully, "with you here, not because I need you to do it for me, because I want you to see it." Warren Shepard looked at her across the kitchen table, in the lamplight at 4 in the morning, with coffee between them and a new calf in the barn and a winter nearly finished. He looked at her the way he looked at things, taking his time, being honest, coming to conclusions he could stand behind. "I believe you can do it," he said. "Every single bit of it, and I am not going anywhere. You run this ranch the way you were born to run it, and you have my word I'll be right here watching you do it." He paused. "And I'll be proud to." Jenny looked at him for a long moment, and then she reached across the table and put her hand over his, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and they stayed like that while the coffee cooled and the darkness outside began its slow movement toward gray, and neither of them needed to say anything more about it because everything that needed to be said had been said. Spring came with determination in late March, and with it everything that needed to be done at once. The calving was the central event, the thing the entire year's financial picture rested on, and Jenny approached it with the kind of comprehensive preparation that was both her nature and her necessity. She and Warren had gone through every heifer and cow in the herd in the last week of March, marking the ones that were closest, setting up the calving pen with clean hay and proper lighting, and the tools they would need, working out a night watch rotation that meant neither of them was running entirely without sleep. The calving ran for 3 weeks, and they lost 2 calves, both to circumstances that no preparation could have prevented, a defect in one and a cord accident in the other. But they saved every mother and every other calf, and the final count gave them 61 new animals in a herd that was now 144 strong. Jenny wrote the number in the ledger with a hand that was steady and a heart that was full. On the morning after the last calf was born and standing, she walked out into the spring morning paddock and looked at the herd in the early light, the new calves with their uncertain legs and their wide, curious eyes, the mothers solid and watchful, the older cattle moving with their unhurried purpose across the new grass that was just beginning its annual reclamation of the brown earth. And she stood there breathing the cold turning warm air and feeling something she had not felt completely since before her father died. She heard Warren come up beside her. She didn't need to look. 61, he said. 61, she agreed. That's a strong spring. Yes, it is. He stood beside her, looking at what she had built back, and she could feel his presence beside her like the warmth from a fire, solid and real and good. I want to say something to you, he said. She turned to look at him. The spring light was full on his face, and she could see in it everything she had come to know about him over these months, the patience and the steadiness and the honesty that ran all the way through him without interruption. I am in love with you, he said. I want to be honest about that. I'm not asking you for anything. I'm not trying to change the arrangement. I'm just tired of not saying it, and you've always known when I'm not saying something. Jenny looked at him for a long moment in the spring light. Then she said, I know you are. I've known it for a while. She paused. I love you too. I've been trying to figure out how to say that without it sounding like an admission of weakness, and I've finally decided that it isn't one. He looked at her with something moving through his dark eyes that was not complicated at all. It was simply warm and clear and sure. It isn't, he said. It's the farthest thing from weakness I can think of. She stepped toward him, and he met her in the middle of that distance, and he kissed her in the spring morning with the cattle moving softly behind them and the new calves making their small voices, and the light coming up gold over the Kansas plain. And it was the kind of kiss that says, I have been waiting for exactly this, and I am not waiting anymore. April was full of work and full of something new. They were not different people. They were still the 2 people who got up before light and worked hard and talked practically and knew every task on 400 acres. But there was a current running through it now that made everything brighter and warmer at the edges. He reached for her hand across the wagon seat in the mornings. She brought him coffee in the paddock the way he had always brought it to her. They talked more, and the talking ranged wider, out past the ranch and into the things they each wanted from their lives and from the future. It was in one of those April conversations, walking the south fence line in the late afternoon, that the future came into focus. What do you want from this? She asked him, meaning all of it, meaning the 2 of them and the life going forward. I want to stay, he said simply, not as a hand. I want to stay as your partner, in every sense of that word. She looked at the fence line, at the land her father had built and her mother had believed in and she had fought for through a hard winter, and she said, Then stay. I'm asking you to marry me, Jenny, he said, because he was a direct man and he wanted there to be no ambiguity about it. She turned to look at him. Her hat was pushed back on her head the way it got when she had been walking, and the afternoon light caught her eyes, and she looked exactly like herself, steady and clear and capable and beautiful in the way she always had been without ever asking anyone to notice it. "Yes," she said, "on the condition that you understand it's still my ranch." "It's your ranch," he said, without a moment of hesitation. "It was always your ranch. I just want to work it beside you." She put her hand on the side of his face, and he put his hand over hers, and they stood on the south fence line of the Abbott Ranch in the April afternoon, and that was where they made the agreement that would hold for the rest of their lives. The wedding was in May, done properly at the little church on Main Street in Caldwell with the minister presiding. It was not a large affair because Jennie had no patience for theater, but it was well attended because the town was curious about the woman who had run her ranch through the winter and come out the other side, and because Warren Shepard had made a quiet, good impression on the people of Caldwell in the months he had been there. Halloran came, beaming with the particular satisfaction of a man whose recommendation had panned out beyond his expectations. Several of the neighboring ranchers came, men who had known Samuel Abbott and respected his daughter. Even two of the women who had been part of Martha Prewitt's commentary circle came, because the story of the winter and the spring calving had made its way through Caldwell in the way stories do, and people had been following it whether they admitted it or not. Darrell Prewitt was not there, which suited everyone fine. Jennie wore her best dress, which was a deep blue that suited her dark hair and her creekwater eyes, and she walked down the aisle of the Caldwell church not on anyone's arm, because she had no one left to walk with her, and Warren Shepard watched her come with an expression on his face that the minister said later he had never seen on a groom before. Not nerves, not performance, just simple and complete recognition, the look of a man who sees something and knows exactly what it is. They said their vows in clear voices, both of them, and when it was done and they walked out into the May sunshine of Caldwell's Main Street, Jennie looked up at the sky for a moment with her hand in Warren's hand, and she thought of her father and her mother, and she felt them close in a way that did not require explanation. They celebrated modestly, a dinner at the boarding house that Halloran had arranged, good food and good company, and enough laughter to make the evening worth remembering. One of the ranchers had brought a fiddle, and there was dancing in the yard of the boarding house until well past 9, and Jennie danced with her husband in the warm May dark and found that he was not a man who pretended to be a better dancer than he was, which she appreciated enormously. They drove home together in the wagon, out on the road that Jennie had driven so many times alone through the winter, and the night sky was enormous above them, full of stars the way the Kansas sky gets in May when the air is clear, and the light pollution of anything modern has not yet dimmed it. Warren drove and she sat beside him with her shoulder against his, and they were quiet for most of the drive in the way of people who don't need to fill the space between them. "Are you happy?" he asked her when the ranch came into sight. She thought about it seriously because she was always serious about honest questions. "Yes," she said, "I am." She paused. "Are you?" "More than I have any right to claim," he said. She shook her head at that. "You have every right," she said firmly. "Don't minimize what you've given this place, Warren. Don't minimize what you've given me." He looked at her in the dark of the wagon, and whatever he felt was in his eyes completely. June arrived with the heat that Kansas June always brought, and with it the deadline on the bank note. Jennie sat with the ledger 3 days before the payment was due and worked the numbers through from every angle, and then she drove into Caldwell with Warren beside her and the payment in the secured box under the wagon seat, and she walked into the Caldwell bank and paid the note in full and came out with the documentation in her hand. She stood on the boardwalk outside the bank in the June heat with the paper in her hand, and Warren stood beside her and she looked at it for a long moment. "Done," she said. "Done," he said. She folded the paper and put it in her coat pocket. "My father never got it fully paid," she said, and her voice had that careful quality it had when she was talking about him. "He always had a portion carrying. He meant to clear it the year he died." "He would have been proud," Warren said. "I know," she said. She looked down the main street of Caldwell at the storefronts and the dusty road and the summer light, and then she looked at her husband. "Let's go home." Summer on the Abbott Ranch, which was now, practically speaking if not yet in any legal documentation, the Abbott Shepard Ranch, though they continued to call it simply the Abbott Ranch because it had always been the Abbott Ranch and that name mattered, was full and good. The calves of the spring were growing into the herd. The cattle were fat on the summer grass. Warren had begun rebuilding the east section of the main barn properly. Not the temporary repair they had done in December, but a full rebuild with new timber. And he worked on it in the late afternoons when the day's tasks were done. And Jennie sometimes came to help, and sometimes came just to sit on the fence and watch him work and drink her coffee and feel the extraordinary, ordinary goodness of the life they were building. There was a moment in July, a Sunday afternoon when the work was caught up enough to permit it, when they rode out together to the far east end of the property, to the twin cottonwood trees where her father and mother were buried. Jennie kept the site clean and tended, and she went when she needed to, which was perhaps more often than she would admit. Warren had never been out there with her before. He stood beside her at the two simple wooden markers and was quiet, which was exactly right. "I used to come out here and talk to them," she said. "I used to tell my father what I was planning and ask him what he thought." She paused. "I still do sometimes." "What do you tell him?" Warren asked. "I tell him the cattle numbers," she said, with a small smile that meant she was being honest and a little rueful at once. "And I tell him the fence line is solid, and I tell him—" She paused. "I told him about you, in December when you first came." Warren looked at her. "What did you say?" "I told him there was a man working the ranch who was good at his job and honest in his dealings, and who seemed to respect that this was my ranch to run." She looked at her father's marker. "I told him I didn't trust it yet and to keep an eye out. And now," Warren said, "and now I came to introduce you properly," she said. She looked at the markers, at her parents' names in the wood. "Mama, Daddy, this is Warren Shepard. He's my husband, and he loves this land nearly as much as you did, and he's the best man I've ever known." Warren stood very still beside her. He reached for her hand and held it, and she let him, and they stood there together under the cottonwood trees in the July heat with the grass moving around them and the sound of the wind in the leaves above. And it was one of those moments that, you know, while it is happening, is the kind you will carry for a long time. August brought the cattle drive preparation. The big drives up the Kishom Trail were still operating in 1882, though the railroad was beginning to draw off a portion of the business, and there was a local arrangement that several of the smaller ranches used together, pooling their cattle for a combined drive north to the railhead at Abilene, with a shared drive crew that spread the cost across the participating ranches. Jennie had been part of this arrangement before with her father, and she had already spoken with the neighboring ranchers involved to confirm the Abbott Ranch's participation. She was going on the drive. This was not a question in her mind. She had ridden drives before with her father, and she knew the work. Warren was not surprised by this decision, and he did not argue with it, and his non-argument was one of the things she loved most about him. They spent August in the preparation, cutting and sorting the cattle that would go, working the ones that would stay back with the pregnant cows and the young calves, getting the horses ready for travel. It was focused, satisfying work, and they did it in their usual complimentary way, which had become more than a working method, had become simply the pattern of who they were together. The night before the drive started, they sat on the porch of the main house in the August dark, the way they had begun doing in the evenings with the stars coming up thick over the plain. "You nervous?" he asked. "About the drive?" "No," she looked at the stars. "I've done this before. Not as the one responsible for the herd numbers." "No," she said, "not as that." She was quiet for a moment. "I'll be fine." "I know you will," he said. And he put his arm around her and she leaned against him, and they sat in the porch dark and watched the stars until they were both tired enough for sleep. The drive took 3 weeks, and it was everything a cattle drive was: exhausting and demanding, and full of the specific concentrated reality of moving a large herd of animals across terrain that did not particularly accommodate them. Jennie rode with the drive crew with the same authority she carried on the ranch, and the men who had known her as Samuel Abbott's daughter and had wondered about her adjusted their wondering within the first 2 days. She could read the herd. She could make decisions under pressure. She could put in the hours. She was, in the straightforward assessment of the drive trail, a good rancher. They arrived at the Abilene railhead on a Monday morning in mid-September, and the price was fair, better than fair by a small but meaningful margin. And Jennie Abbott stood at the railhead with the numbers in her head and felt the entire accumulated weight of the last 11 months resolve itself into something she could put her hands on and hold. She wrote the number in her small trail ledger, the one she had brought in her saddlebag, and she looked at it for a long time. Then she wrote a letter to Warren, even though she would be home in 4 days, because she wanted to tell him in a way she could hold on to. She wrote, "We did it. The herd came in strong and the price came in fair and the ranch is standing. Come the autumn, we will be in good order. I am coming home." The drive back was shorter without the cattle, and when she rode up the track toward the Abbott Ranch on a clear September afternoon and saw the barn with its freshly rebuilt east wall gleaming in the afternoon light, and Warren coming out of the paddock gate already moving toward her when he heard her horse, she felt something settle in her chest that was not relief exactly, but was the specific peace of a person who has arrived at the right place. He came to her horse and she swung down from the saddle, and he held her face in both his hands and looked at her the way he looked at her, taking his time, being honest, and then he kissed her in the September afternoon, and she put her arms around him and held on for a good long moment. "The numbers," he said when she pulled back. "Better than we projected," she said. She held up the ledger. He took it, looked at the number, and looked up at her with that smile, the full one, the one she had first seen on the fence line in December and had been watching for ever since. "Jennie Abbott," he said. "Jennie Shepard," she said, and she had not fully used that name before in quite that way, and the sound of it in her own voice surprised her a little with how right it was. "Jennie Shepard," he agreed. "You proved it." "We proved it," she said. "No," he said gently and firmly. I watched, I helped when you let me, but this was yours." She looked at him for a moment, and she felt something in her eyes that she allowed because she had decided that allowing it was not weakness. "Thank you," she said, "for believing it before I was sure." "I was always sure," he said. The autumn came in, golden and clear, and the ranch moved into its fall rhythm with the ease of a thing that has found its proper motion. They took stock. They repaired and prepared. They watched the herd and managed the pastures and brought the horses through their fall conditioning and fixed every fence section that needed fixing before the winter came back around. They did it together, as they had done everything together, and the work between them had the quality now of something deeply practiced and deeply satisfying. Two people who had learned to move together without losing their individual purposes. In October, Jennie told Warren she was expecting. She told him in the kitchen, at the table, with the morning light coming through the window over the basin, and she said it directly, the way she said everything, looking at him with her steady eyes. Warren Shepard sat with it for a moment, the way he sat with everything that mattered. Then something moved through his face that was entirely unguarded and entirely beautiful, and he stood up from his chair and came around the table to her and put his arms around her carefully, as if she might be different than she had been before this moment, which she was. "When?" he said, his voice close to her ear. "Spring," she said. "April, I think." "Spring," he said, and there was something in the word that made it sound like exactly what it was, an arrival, a beginning, a continuation of something that was going to outlast both of them. He held her face in his hands the way he did, and she felt everything in his expression that she had needed to feel in those first cold months of the winter that now seemed very far away and very close at the same time. "Are you happy?" she asked him, echoing his question from the night of their wedding. "I don't have words big enough," he said honestly. She laughed, the unplanned kind, and put her hands over his hands on her face, and they stood in the kitchen in the October morning light, and were simply, completely, entirely glad. The news spread in the way of a small town, gently and with goodwill from most quarters, because the story of Jennie and Warren and the Abbott Ranch had become a story that people in Caldwell had been following and had, whether they admitted it or not, been rooting for. Halloran sent over a sack of good flour with a note that said simply, "For the new year coming." The minister and his wife brought a jar of preserved peaches. Even some of the women who had been less generous in their comments earlier in the year came around, because the specific miracle of new life has a way of resolving old pettiness. Darrell Prewitt made no comment, which was fine. Winter came again, but this winter was different. Last winter had been survival, had been proof, had been a sustained test of everything Jennie was and wanted to be. This winter was a settled thing. The ranch was in good shape. The finances were solid. The herd was strong. The work was still hard, as it always was and always would be, but it was the heart of a thing functioning well rather than the heart of a thing fighting to exist. Jennie was careful with herself in the way that was practical and not excessive, because she was not a woman who dramatized her circumstances, and Warren was careful with her in the way that was attentive and not smothering, because he was not a man who failed to read what was needed. They worked through the winter with modified arrangements. He took the heavier external tasks, and she managed the indoor work and the lighter portions, and neither of them treated this as anything other than a temporary and practical shifting of labor. They talked more in that winter than they had in any previous season, and it was good talking, ranging talk. They talked about what they wanted to build on the ranch in the years ahead. They talked about additional land that might become available on the south side of the property, and whether it was worth pursuing. They talked about the cattle breed, and whether there were bloodlines worth considering for improving the herd over time. They talked about the world, about the territory, about the way the frontier was changing, and what the railroad's advance would mean for operations like theirs. One evening in January, sitting by the stove with the wind making its familiar noise against the eaves, Warren said something that had been forming in him for a while. "I want to file the legal papers," he said, "to add my name to the deed, not to change anything about what it is, but to make it official that this is our home together." Jennie looked at him steadily. "I've been thinking about that too," she said. "What I want is the name to stay Abbott, Abbott and Shepard maybe, something that holds both of them." "Abbott and Shepard," he said, trying it. "That's what this ranch is," she said. "It's what my father built and what we are building together." "Abbott and Shepard it is," he said. "We'll go to Caldwell when the weather breaks and file it right." She nodded and reached over and put her hand on his, and he turned his hand over and held hers, the way he always had since the night at the kitchen table when they had first let themselves be honest. The baby was born on the 7th of April, a clear and cold spring morning that had not yet decided whether it was going to be winter or spring, which seemed fitting. It was a boy, a large and indignant boy who announced his arrival at considerable volume, and the doctor who had ridden out from Caldwell declared him healthy and fine, and of good solid stock, which made Warren laugh and made Jennie look at her husband with the particular expression that said she found him both exasperating and completely lovable. They named him Samuel for her father. Samuel Abbott Shepard, which went into the Caldwell records and was recorded in the family Bible that Jennie had kept on the shelf since her mother's death and had been adding to ever since. Warren held his son in the April afternoon while Jennie rested, sitting in the rocking chair that had been in the Abbott house since before Jennie could remember, and he sat there in the late light with the baby in his arms and an expression on his face that was made of something he had no previous name for. When Jennie woke from a short sleep and looked over at him, sitting there in the rocking chair with their son in the light, she felt such a wave of love for both of them that it was almost a physical force. "Hello," she said from the pillow. He looked over at her, and the expression on his face went from wonder to tenderness so smoothly that she felt it like warmth. "Hello, Mrs. Shepard," he said. "How is he?" "Perfect," Warren said. He's been looking at things very seriously. I think he's assessing the quality of the woodwork." She laughed, and the baby startled at the sound and then settled, and Warren looked back down at him with something in his face that made the whole room feel like the right place to be. The spring calving that year ran concurrent with Samuel's first weeks of life, which was a genuine test of both of them. Jennie was back on her feet faster than the doctor recommended, because she was who she was, and Warren managed the nights in the barn with the laboring cows so that she could feed the baby, and they operated in a state of managed exhaustion that was also full of a kind of extraordinary richness. Life demanding everything from you at once is, paradoxically, one of the most alive states a person can be in. They came through it. Of course they came through it. By June, with Samuel on a blanket in the morning sun outside the kitchen door, and the spring calves growing fat in the south pasture, and the land in full green growth around them, and the deed to the Abbott and Shepard ranch filed properly at the county courthouse in Caldwell, Jennie stood at the kitchen window watching her husband play with their son in the yard, Warren lying on his back in the grass, with the baby propped on his chest. Both of them looking up at the sky with the same expression of serious inquiry. And she felt the whole shape of the last 18 months gather itself in her mind like a landscape you've been standing in and finally seen from a distance. A year and a half ago, she had stood in the mud of a ruined cattle pen in the October rain and decided to save this ranch alone. She had said, or at least thought, the thing that was burning in her, that she would prove this ranch could run without anyone's help, that she would be the one to prove what everyone assumed was impossible, that she would stand on this land her mother had believed in and her father had built and she had grown up with, and she would make it good. And then a man had come out on a cold December morning and fixed a wall with her without telling her what she was doing wrong, and she had hired him on, and he had watched her prove exactly what she intended to prove, and somewhere in the watching he had seen her completely. And somewhere in being seen, she had understood that allowing yourself to be witnessed by someone who respects you is not the same as needing to be rescued. And that is a different lesson, entirely, than the one she had thought she was teaching herself. She stepped out of the kitchen and crossed the yard and sat down in the grass beside them, and Samuel, who at 2 months old was beginning to recognize that certain presences were particularly good ones, made a small sound that was not yet a word but was getting in that direction. Warren turned his head to look at her. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm thinking about December," she said. "The first week when you came." He waited. "I was so sure I didn't need anyone," she said. "I had it all arranged in my head, me and this land and the work, and no one who could tell me what I couldn't do." "You didn't need anyone," he said. "Not in the sense you meant it. You never needed saving, Jennie. You were already saving it when I rode in." "I know," she said, "but I needed this." She gestured between the three of them in the grass. "I just didn't know it yet." He moved Samuel carefully from his chest to hers, and she held her son in the June sun, and Warren put his arm around her in the grass, and the ranch spread around them in every direction, green and good and solid. 400 acres of a thing well made by several generations of stubborn people who had loved it hard. "Are you glad he showed up?" Warren asked, meaning himself, and there was something in his voice that was almost but not quite the sound of a man who still sometimes wondered at his own luck. She leaned into him. "Every day," she said. "Every single one." They sat in the summer grass until Samuel fell asleep, and then until the afternoon began its slow turn toward evening, and then until Warren said they ought to get back to the cattle before the day was entirely spent. And Jennie agreed and started to get up, and he stood first and offered her his hand, and she took it, and he pulled her up, and they stood face to face in the evening light, their son between them in her arms. And he kissed her forehead, and then the side of her face, and then her mouth with the particular warmth of someone who is not in a hurry because they are not going anywhere. "Come on," she said when she stepped back. "There's work to do." "There's always work to do," he said. "Yes," she said, "and I love that too." They walked back toward the barn together, and the evening light came in low and golden over the Kansas plain, catching the new grass and the fence lines and the roof of the rebuilt barn. And the name on the gate post, freshly painted the previous spring by Warren on a morning when he had thought Jennie wasn't watching, and she had watched from the kitchen window with her coffee in both hands. ABBOTT and SHEPARD Ranch, in clean black letters, steady and clear. The years that followed were the years of a life well built. They had 2 more children, a second son, named Thomas for Warren's father, born in the autumn of 1885, and a daughter, Clara, born in the spring of 1888, who came into the world with a full head of her mother's dark hair and her father's quiet, watchful eyes, and a personality from her earliest months that suggested she was going to have very specific opinions about almost everything, which made both her parents smile at each other over her head. They added the south parcel in 1886 when it came available, 60 acres of good grazing land that expanded the ranch to 460 acres and allowed them to grow the herd into a genuinely profitable operation. They hired 2 ranch hands in 1887, young brothers from a family that had come up from Oklahoma Territory, and Jennie managed them with the same clear expectations and fair dealing that her father had always used, and they were loyal the way loyal men are when they are treated with respect. Darrell Prewitt's operation to the west hit a rough patch in 1886 and contracted significantly, and he eventually sold his own spread in 1889, which Jennie noted without crowing about because crowing wasn't her nature, and because his trouble was not her doing, and she took no satisfaction in anyone's loss. Caldwell grew and changed around them, as frontier towns do, the rawness of the trail town slowly transitioning into the more settled character of a permanent community. The Kishome Trail drove fewer and fewer cattle as the railroads pushed south, and the trail lost its primacy, and the nature of the cattle business in Kansas shifted with it. But the Abbott and Shepard Ranch adapted, as it had always adapted, because its people were the kind who paid attention and moved when moving was required. On the autumn evening of their 10th wedding anniversary, in 1892, Jennie and Warren sat on the porch of the main house, the house that had been expanded twice now, with a proper addition on the east side that gave the children rooms of their own and gave Warren and Jennie a bedroom with a window that looked out over the east pasture and watched the evening come down over their land. Samuel was 9 and already his mother's shadow on the ranch, asking questions about everything with the systematic thoroughness that was wholly hers. Thomas was 7 and more like his father, quiet and observant and capable of a patience that surprised most people who met him. Clara was 4 and in charge of everything, which was simply an observable fact that the entire family had accepted. The children were inside with the ranch cook, a woman named Helen who had joined them the year before and who managed the domestic side of things with cheerful competence. The evening was warm for October, one of those autumn gifts that the Kansas plain occasionally offers before the cold comes back. 10 years, Warren said. 10 years, she said. What do you think your father would say? She smiled. She looked out at the pasture, at the fence lines that were solid and clean, at the herd moving in the evening light, at the barn with its rebuilt walls and its new roof, at the gate post with the painted name. He would say the fence needs going over on the northwest corner, she said. Warren laughed, and she loved that laugh completely, had loved it for 10 years and expected to love it for the rest of her life. And your mother, he said. She thought about her mother, who had come from Virginia when she was 22 years old because she had trusted the man beside her and believed in what they were building. She thought about the twin cottonwood trees at the east end of the property, about the markers she still kept clean, about the conversations she had there in the evenings sometimes when the work was done, and she needed to think. My mother would say it turned out exactly right, she said. Warren reached for her hand in the porch dark, the same reaching that had begun on a night 10 years before at a kitchen table, and she gave it to him, the same giving she had been doing ever since. I want to tell you something, he said. Tell me. He held her hand and looked out at the land they had made together, the land that had been her father's dream and her mother's faith and her own determined, stubborn, wholehearted life's work. "The day I rode in here," he said, "I wasn't looking for anything in particular. I was just a man between things looking for honest work." He paused. "And I found honest work. And I found the most extraordinary woman I have ever known. And I found a home." His voice was steady but not unmoved. "And I want you to know that every day since the day you let me hold the other end of that plank, I have been exactly where I wanted to be. There is not one day of it I would trade." Jennie looked at her husband in the autumn dark, at the man who had watched her prove what she needed to prove, who had believed her when she said she would, who had stayed at the edges of her proving and been there when it was done, and had never once suggested that she needed anything other than herself to get it right, who had been, in the particular language of real love, not a rescue but a revelation. "Warren Shepard," she said, and her voice had something in it that was full and warm and without reservation. "You are the best thing I didn't know I was looking for." He turned to her in the porch dark and put his hand against her face, and she covered it with her own hand, and they sat together on the porch of the Abbott and Shepard ranch as the stars came up over Kansas, solid and brilliant and familiar, and the cattle settled into the pasture, and the children's voices made their small sounds inside the house, and the wind came over the plain with its clean, particular smell, and everything was right and whole and theirs. The land was still there in the morning as it always was, and they were still there too, and that was everything.